Happy Sunday, everyone. Today is a fun, random, interesting little topic. Will there ever be Mormons on Mars? Mormons have a deep history with science fiction, which we'll talk about. I am not the only one to wonder about this. I just found some random posts on X. The real red pill is that Mormons will be the first to colonize Mars, says one. Obviously, pronatalist Mormons are most likely to colonize Mars. Not entirely kidding, says another person. Or do Mormons really get to live on their own planet when they die? How many Mormons occupy Mars today? Elon would know. I think the Mormons might be putting a team together to colonize Mars. Or if there were life on Mars, the Mormons would have the best space program just to convert the Martians. Final one. Someone here posts, exoplanetary Zionism isn't just a dream, it is possible. A future where Jewish life exists without fear, where children can thrive without the shadows of hatred, where Jewish civilization can blossom and grow in untold new ways. Someone quote tweets that and says, sorry, pal, if anyone's going to colonize Mars in the name of a religious group, it's absolutely going to be the Mormons. So there's been a long history, as I said, of Mormons in sci-fi and writing sci-fi. Certainly, there are plenty of Latter-day Saints who themselves are authors and creators of science fiction. For example, 1982, this guy wrote not even a book, a story called The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, 2017 AD. And the story tells about a colonization of Mars by a remnant of Lamanites in the year 650, and a planet-sized temple on Saturn, new revelations being received in the Martian language. Kind of fun. There was another Latter-day Saint who wrote The Investigator in 2019, a story about two missionaries tracking into a UFO. Certainly there's Orson Scott Card and the like, right? Ender's Game and others. What's interesting to me is that there are a lot of non-Latter-day Saints who tie in references to Mormonism in their science fiction. Isaac Asimov, for example, who's the author of the Foundation series and I, Robot, in 1982, he said that his wife and he have a special interest in stories about Mormons. In Janet's case, there's a loose genealogical connection. In my case, there's an interest in any group that considers me a Gentile. Robert Heinlein in Double Star. In this story, the main character is an actor hired to stand in for an important political leader who had been kidnapped. And so there's negotiations with the Martians. The book was written like 2 decades before the Viking probes landed on Mars. And at one point, the main character, participates in an alien adoption ceremony. And he writes in there, in the story, I reached the ramp leading down to the inner nest and started on down. And then it has all these asterisks. And then he continues, that line of asterisks represents the adoption ceremony. Why? Because it is limited to the members of the Ka nest. It is a family matter. Put it this way, a Mormon may have very close Gentile friends, but does that friendship get a Gentile inside the temple at Salt Lake City? It never has and it never will. Martians visit very freely back and forth between their nests, but a Martian enters the inner nest only of his own family. Even his conjugate spouses are thus not thus privileged. I have no more right to tell the details of the adoption ceremony than a lodge brother has to be specific about ritual outside the lodge, talking about Masons there. So lots of references like this to Mormon belief or Mormons themselves throughout lots of science fiction literature. There's Greg Bear's Moving Mars, where in the story Mormons constitute one of the few remaining religious cultures on a future Earth where most people have these artificial enhancements, like personality enhancements or knowledge enhancements, and but Mormons don't. And so the main character, who is a native of Mars, travels to Earth, is assisted by a Mormon senator, I think it was, and finds like that, oh, I have a lot in common with you, more so than mainstream Earth culture, which by this point they're artificially changing much about themselves. And the quote is, you know, I've been an outcast of sorts in Washington for a decade. I'm a Mormon. I'm not therapied or enhanced, but I've managed to do well. If anybody found out about my talking to you, I could lose everything I've fought for, all status, all power, all influence. So that's what you see in a lot of these stories, is a little bit of kind of Mormon theology, or more likely kind of like cultural practices stemming from your beliefs, right? There's a number of others. Of course, there's Battlestar Galactica, which has a number of religious influences interwoven into it. For the Mormons, right, we've got Kobol, which is the mother world of humanity. And of course, that's an anagram. When you mix up the letters, you get Kolob. Kolob being the star nearest the throne of God, as we learn in the Pearl of Great Price. In Battlestar Galactica, Kobol is a planet rather than a star, but clearly there's a connection between the two. There's also a ship named the ship Kobol that appears briefly. The colonies in Battlestar Galactica are run by a council of the 12, sometimes referred to as a quorum of the 12, with a president. It's a political body, but they do have some religious responsibilities. They call marriages sealings. One couple is married with the words, "A union between this man and this woman, not only for now, but for all the eternities." There was, of course, the more recent Battlestar Galactica. Then there was one in the 1970s. And in that version of it, there's a couple episodes called War of Gods. And in there's these angels from ships of light who arrive, and they declare that agency is supreme. They say, we cannot interfere with freedom of choice. His, yours, anyone's. And then there's like this Satan type figure who's at war with the angels in the ships of light, and called Count Iblis. And they say Count Iblis can only control those who had freely given him dominion. In the same episode, these beings say, as you are now, we once were. As we are now, you may become. I mean, can it get any more obvious, right? That's the famous Lorenzo Snow couplet. As man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. So you get lots of these references in Battlestar Galactica. There's Starship Troopers, where you've got Port Joe Smith, which is a colony founded by a group of Mormon extremists on this planet called Dantana. You can see the Angel Moroni there. There's The Expanse. I never read the books, but I enjoyed the show. Here's, for example, 10 minutes into the first episode, you can see there the Book of Mormon musical. They're on like a space station or whatever, and so you can see the Book of Mormon musical in the pilot episode. You get the third episode in, and here you got this missionary guy called Elder Murray, and he's badgering the kind of main character. The protagonist says, "Do you like to laugh?" And then he pitches this guy on coming to see the Mormons do a stand-up routine at the local comedy club. And so we kind of learned there that there's these missionaries going around and trying to recruit people. In the following episode, we're introduced to something that pervades the rest of the show and the books, which is the LDSS Nauvoo. So not the USS or whatever, the LDSS, which stands for Latter-day Saint ship. Nauvoo. The Nauvoo is this massive ship. Let's watch a little clip about that.
Can I help you?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
You seem a little anxious. Are you okay?
Well, I am kind of in a hurry.
Where are you going?
Well, that's the thing. I've seen your sign outside. It says, we know where we're going. I think maybe I know where I need to go now, too.
What would make you positive?
Well, why don't you tell me a little bit more about your journey?
I was born into this, but I've never doubted it.
No. I mean, a big one. Nauvoo.
2 kilometers long, half a kilometer wide. 10 levels of environmental engineering, crew quarters, schools, wastewater treatment, machine shops, forges. And at the center, a piece of earth curved back on itself. Our Eden.
Well, I've never been to Earth, but it kind of looks like a big, huge metal rock tunnel to me.
The cylinder will be sealed, and after the initial acceleration, the body will begin to spin. All this will be farmland.
Shit.
It's designed to give the illusion of light and heat that is as gentle and warm as a summer's day.
Okay, so what's interesting to me is why throughout all these science fiction stories, and many more I haven't covered, I mean, there's like hundreds, why are Mormons stereotypically perhaps depicted as colonizers, as explorers, as settlers? I think the answers to that question are probably fairly straightforward and simple, right? There's certainly precedent with our history, with how, early Mormons were colonizing and the concept of gathering and settling new land, certainly in the East, but then also in the West. So there's lots of precedent in our history. I think another aspect too, certainly you see this in The Expanse with this expansive, massive ship that was built for the Mormon church, that the church has the financial resources to be able to do ventures of this type, to build ships that big, to go colonize other planets, right? It's perceived by the authors and creators of these stories that, oh, the Mormons have a lot of money, therefore we can easily assume that they would be, colonizing another planet. There's history, of course, largely because of the polygamy skirmishes, but also even in like Nauvoo and the Council of 50 and the Theodemocracy and the Nauvoo Legion and all this stuff where there's conflict with the government. Early Mormonism was fraught with political conflict, and so that becomes very easy for writers to basically say, look, they've always been kind of this, until recent decades, this kind of countercultural, outside the mainstream type of faith. Therefore, that works really well in these fictional stories as well. I think the final answer is that the Latter-day Saint culture and faith is wrapped up in missionary work, right? This idea that you don't just focus on yourselves. If there are people out there in far-flung territories, right? Wasn't the first temple that was built outside of the kind of early ones was out in Hawaii, or one of the very, very early ones, right? It's like, let's get out to the ships of the sea and the far-flung places and gather people in and bring them here, right? So I think the fact that our church doctrine and culture is so missionary-centric also lends itself well to some guy in a ship station saying, come see Mormon comedy at the stand-up, as a way to like draw people in and evangelize their faith a little bit more. Of course, the idea of Mars colonization, long considered part of the fictional, staple of stories that we could imagine, is increasingly getting closer to becoming science reality. We've got multiple companies and institutions all now aggressively, somewhat, pursuing that goal. Of course, we've got NASA. They have an Artemis program, which aims to send humans first back to the moon, then to Mars. So that's kind of their trajectory. You've got other groups like Blue Origin, which is Bezos's company, the European Space Agency, the Chinese Space Agency, all of whom are working on Mars plans. Of course, king of them all then is SpaceX, which is actively developing its Starship ships that can launch cargo and people and in enough frequency to be able to meet a target window and get enough supplies there for a little, habitat, and start to have transport between the two planets. So he's ahead of everybody, and it's fascinating. You listen to interviews with Elon, and he thinks that our species should be multiplanetary and whatever, but it's clear like he really wants to have people living on Mars, which raises all kinds of questions about, even just the governance of a place like that, and how that's all, the economics, how all that is going to work out. So then that raises the question, let's fast forward 50 years, 100 years, and there's now colonies of humans living on Mars, having babies on Mars, more immigrants, coming to Mars by the day, by the week, whatever, just more and more people, right? And Mars starts to grow. Well, what would it be like? Would Mormons be part of that? Would members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints be part of that? And you can look at that a couple different ways. They could be part of that as settlers, as colonists, as people going on these expeditions. I think that's perhaps less likely, because in the past it was as a group. It was, we are a group of fellow Latter-day Saints and we are moving here. We are gathering here. We want to be together. As opposed to just, oh, we got a couple random Mormons who are part of like this group of 30 people and they're going to go colonize something. That doesn't, jive as much, at least with the precedent of how things have gone. And also because the church in recent years has shied away from any gathering concept to a specific location, specifically the United States, specifically Utah / maybe Missouri. Instead, now gathering Israel is just spiritual in nature, but not physical. The church leaders now are saying, stay where you are, don't move, gather Israel in your backyard type of thing. So that also seems to suggest that members of the church would not be at the forefront of an active colonization project to gather on Mars or to settle it. Of course, if large groups of people started going to Mars and relocating there and being born there, that would create a group of people who need to hear the gospel as well. So if not as settlers or colonists, one could presume that the church could start calling missionaries to the Mars mission, right? You're going to go there, you're going to live there for a couple of years and preach the gospel to the people on Mars, and going to have a little branch organized and a little church and whatever, right? And so, especially if flights are costly, right? The church has the financial resources to do something like that. But I think the cost would have to be reduced to hit the critical mass of population to have a lot of people going to Mars. I think the church, just like when it was sending missionaries abroad to the islands of the sea, would see people on Mars or up on a space station or whatever similarly, right? There are people, they need to hear the gospel. Let's go to them. This is a sacred duty, spreading the gospel across God's creations. And then I was thinking, like, we've got the Sabbath day, right? And we rest one day a week, and our kind of church worship experience is kind of built around that. But on Mars, it would be different, right? On Mars, a day, which is called a sol, lasts for 24 hours and 37 minutes, which is slightly longer than Earth. So then I was like, okay, would their Sabbath day it would be based off sols? And so it'd be like 6 days on, 1 day off still, even though their days are all longer. Or is the Sabbath an Earth-centric measurement? 6 days he worked and 1 day he rested, but that can't be right, because then you go to like Abraham and the Pearl of Great Price, for example, in chapter 3, it says, "The Lord said unto me by the Urim and Thummim that Kolob was after the manner of the Lord, according to its times and seasons in the revolutions thereof, that one revolution was a day unto the Lord after his manner of reckoning, it being 1,000 years according to the time appointed unto that whereunto I stand." I remember reading this as a missionary or teenager or whatever, like, okay, 1,000 years for us is 1 day for the Lord. And so maybe that, the earth is, 6,000 years old, or, whatever. Like, you get into that kind of math where maybe it literally means day in the scriptures, where it says the Lord worked for 6 days and then he rested, right? And then you get like extensions of that where people start to theorize that, okay, our earth initially was closer in God's presence and operated on similar timing, which is why he could only work for a few days. And then when it fell, when Adam, and Eve partook of the fruit, it fell and was located elsewhere where, and none of that, those are all theories, right? It's total speculation and whatever. But none of that really made sense to me until I watched Interstellar. And if you've seen the film, like if you haven't seen the film, you're doing something wrong. Go fix that. It is phenomenal. I've seen it a dozen times. In the film, right, they go to one of the planets where it's closer to a black hole. They're learning about gravity, the theory of relativity, and that they're going to, quote unquote, lose a lot of time, Earth time, right, if they go down to this planet, because I don't remember off the top of my head what it was, but it's like every minute, we're on the planet is like, a week on Earth or whatever, right? And so they have this anxiety, like, we can't spend a lot of time on this planet because time on Earth is going to slip by and all of our loved ones are going to, be old and die. And at first I was like, okay, yeah, that's interesting. Einstein's theory of relativity and whatever, right? And then I learned that no, this is a real thing. It's not just a theory. It's called gravitational time dilation. GPS satellites, for example, that we all frequently use, they use precise timing based on atomic clocks. These satellites, orbit like, I don't know, 20, 30, whatever thousand miles above the Earth, where gravity is weaker, right? So that causes the clocks to tick a little bit faster, just barely, every day compared to clocks on the ground. But so they correct for that. The GPS clocks kind of, self-correct to maintain precise time. But that's like an example and evidence of gravitational time dilation. There was an experiment in the early 70s where they flew atomic clocks on commercial airplanes and then compared them to clocks on the ground. So the clocks at the on the planes at higher altitude, again, like the satellite where Earth's gravity is weaker, ticked slightly faster than those on the ground. So the GPS is just a further thing away, less gravity, and a more frequent daily confirmation that gravity does affect, space-time somehow and the perception of time. So then I'm like, okay, that's fascinating, because if that's what's happening here, this gravitational time dilation, maybe there is something to be said for the fact that, like, the Earth is was located closer to God and closer to Kolob. There's like denser gravity for whatever reason, and that's kind of changing your perception of time. But that, I don't know, that's fascinating to me. All theoretical, all speculative, but this idea that maybe gravity, like in the movie Interstellar, actually has something to do with one's perception of time. Again, in that verse in Abraham, right? Kolob was after the manner of the Lord according to its times and seasons in the revolutions thereof. So revolution, spinning around whatever sun or whatever, was a day unto the Lord after his manner of reckoning. So that just makes it seem like, okay, on a planet like Kolob, maybe maybe it literally feels like a day, right? And Jesus is like, oh, I'm going to create a new world, right? And like, okay, today I did all the animals, and maybe it feels like what to us would be a normal day, but it's different in all these other locations where gravity is like, that's, I don't know, it's fascinating to me to think through that. Okay, and then, a final thing to bring up here is, it makes me think of the atonement and the fact that God's children are already multiplanetary. So here's Elon trying to take us to Mars under the guise of, mankind should be multiplanetary, to which the Mormons would say, we already are, perhaps other galaxies or universes or who knows what, right? For example, in an 1832 vision alongside Sidney Rigdon, Joseph Smith in section 76 revealed that by him and through him and of him, the worlds, plural, are and were created, and the inhabitants thereof are begotten sons and daughters unto God. Okay, so God has created many worlds, and the inhabitants thereof, of those many worlds, are sons and daughters unto God. We also get in the book of Moses, chapter 1, the Lord talking to Moses, and worlds without numbers have I created, and I also created them for mine own purpose, and by the Son I created them, which is mine only begotten. And the first man of all men have I called Adam, which is many. But only an account of this earth and the inhabitants thereof give I unto you. For behold, there are many worlds that have passed away by the word of my power, and there are many that now stand, and innumerable are they unto man, but all things are numbered unto me, for they are mine, and I know them. It's kind of interesting, the semantic, stuff going on here, right? Like it kind of feels more like the biblical, like 40 days and 40 nights, which just really means a lot of days, right? And so here you've got the Lord saying in the same verse, no, excuse me, in between the three verses at the beginning, he says, worlds without number have I created. And then later he says, they're innumerable unto man, but all things are numbered unto me. So I guess if he's saying worlds without number, he's likely implying worlds without number to you, right? Because they're innumerable unto man, but to me, they're not innumerable. Anyways, lots of worlds, lots of inhabitants thereof. But to Moses, he says, I'm only going to give you an account of this earth and the inhabitants thereof. So I'm not going to tell you about all the other stuff. I'm just going to tell you on your world, what's going on here. And then we have, as I mentioned on a past musing recently, the book of Enoch, In our revealed version through Joseph Smith, which is contained in chapter 7 of Moses, this will sound familiar, of course. Enoch said unto the Lord, how is it that thou canst weep, seeing thou art holy, and from all eternity to all eternity? And were it possible that man could number the particles of the earth, yea, millions of earths like this, it would not be a beginning to the number of thy creations. And thy curtains are stretched out still, and yet thou art there, and thy bosom is there, and also thou art just, thou art merciful and kind forever. So Enoch is being shown all this stuff by God, and he sees the crimes of humanity and the horrible things happening, and he sees God weeping, and he's wondering how. And in response to that, Enoch is saying that the number of thy creations, there's no beginning to it, millions of earths like this, etc. Presumably because Enoch has been taught or shown the expansiveness of God's creations. Of course, in the temple endowment, you've got language like this about other worlds and what's happened on other worlds. You've got quotes from church leaders over the years. I'll share maybe just two. Joseph Fielding Smith said, we are not the only people that the Lord has created. We have brothers and sisters on other earths. They look like us because they too are the children of God and were created in his image, for they are also his offspring. You've also got Neil Maxwell, who said, we do not know how many inhabited worlds there are or where they are, but certainly we are not alone. And I think that's all plausible, especially from revealed, restored truth through Joseph Smith, contained in the D&C and the Pearl of Great Price, confirming this just expansive undertaking of our Creator. And to me, that just kind of makes rational sense. Like, all these worlds exist and massive galaxies and massive universes. And every time they release a new updated, like whatever the new Hubble is, it's like the James something, I can't remember its name, but they've got like the new and improved one, right? And you get this photo and they're like, oh, here's this massive photo of the sky. And we just took this one tiny little speck and then focused on that. And then it's this massive image of all these galaxies just in that like tiny little corner compared to a 360 spherical space all around you kind of stuff. And so to me, it's very rational to say, if God is the creator of all of this, right, then it stands to reason that, as he himself says through Joseph, that not only has he created other inhabitable worlds, but that they are in fact inhabited. So over the years, as I've thought about this, I used to read a lot more science fiction than I have of late, but whenever this idea would pop in my head, I would think, okay, so that means that all of God's children on all the other planets, if they're going to be, I'll call it Christian, if they're a kind of believing Christian in Jesus and Heavenly Father, they are required as part of their faith on all those other planets to believe in extraterrestrial human beings. That is a core tenet of the Christian faith on every other planet, if you assume that Christ's atonement on the earth was the atonement, not just for this earth, but for all of God's children, which I think is probably a safe assumption. I'll share a scripture in just a moment where we can tease that out. But if in fact Jesus came to earth and lived here and did the atonement here, and that satisfies all of God's children, then for those children on other planets to believe in God and use the atonement and apply the atonement in their life, they are required to believe, oh yeah, there's this other planet out there somewhere, and Jesus lived and he taught these things and he died and suffered in Gethsemane and all the things. Therefore, we're going to be resurrected. Therefore, I can be, cleansed of my sins. Now, to me, it stands to reason that just as Christ visited the Nephites after he died, that he took a similar trip to wherever else God's children are on other planets. And so presumably on those planets, there have been prophets. They have their own scriptures, their own teachings through those prophets, their own records of Christ's visit, right? So they don't have a Bible. They don't have this like, oh, stories of Jesus when he was alive, right? But they have their Moseses and their Abrahams and their whatever, right? They've got their own prophets on those planets who are God's messengers to those people. Presumably Christ visited them as well. So it's fascinating to think, like, we think of scripture in this very like biblical earth-centric sense, but thinking about all of the scriptures across the universe. That's kind of really interesting. Let's read in conclusion section 76. We'll return to that a few verses later, starting in verse 41. That he came into the world, even Jesus, to be crucified for the world, and to bear the sins of the world, and to sanctify the world, and to cleanse it from all unrighteousness, that through him all might be saved, whom the Father had put into his power and made by him, who glorifies the Father and saves all the works of his hands, except those sons of perdition who deny the Son after the Father has revealed him. So when I first read verse 41, I was like, oh, maybe Christ's atonement was just for this world, right? He was crucified for the world, to bear the sins of the world, to sanctify the world. That sounds like a very earth-centric atonement. And I was like, well, that doesn't say anywhere there that the same actions don't apply to other worlds. It says, well, yeah, if Jesus tells you, I died for you, he's not saying that he didn't also die for others or suffer for them, right? He's just saying, in this case, I'm talking to you and I suffered and died for you, which is true, but it's not exclusive. He's not saying that there aren't other people to whom that same thing applies. So for Jesus to be crucified for the world, bear the sins of the world, and sanctify the world, I think it stands to reason that that's not exclusive, and that while true, yes, he did bear the sins of the world, he also bore the sins of people on other worlds. And that's, in my opinion, confirmed by the subsequent verses that I read, that through Christ all might be saved, whom the Father had put into his power and made by him. And it says that Christ saves all the works of his hands, right? That sounds much more general to me, that Christ's atonement did happen on the earth. It did apply to and cover all of God's children, and that therefore for them on other planets to believe in the atonement, they have to understand that Jesus is a real person who had a real life like us, just on a different planet, and the people on that planet killed him, and he suffered for our sins, and then, oh, hey, he visited us afterward to tell us all these things, right? It's fascinating to think about that. And, other sheep I have which are not of this fold, right? And we think, oh, yeah, he visited the Nephites, to which I say, yes, and I think he visited plenty of other people too, who have written those stories down, and not perhaps, but I believe one day we'll get, and be fascinating to read through that stuff. So, will there ever be Mormons on Mars? I mean, I think that's just a function of, will the Mars expeditions that Elon and others are pursuing ever be successful? Because if that becomes successful and you get kind of a critical mass of people traveling to, emigrating to, and being born on Mars, I think absolutely there will be, missionaries. There will be members of the church of their own volition who go there, right, and relocate there. I think there will be a branch there, and perhaps more. Like, I think that all just makes sense. But it's just like one tiny little drop in an ocean of multiplanetary Mormonism, right? Where I guess on other planets it wouldn't be Mormonism because they don't have the Book of Mormon. But you get my point. That the cosmology of our faith is fascinating. Thinking about the gravitational time dilation, and thinking of Kolob and different times and seasons, and how does Christ even or God move between places? Remember when Joseph had the visit from Moroni, he said it was like a conduit opened up in the air, and he kind of, so then I'm thinking, like, are these wormholes? Is this, and in Interstellar, he's explaining to the guy how it works, and he folds the piece of paper and puts a pen right through. He's like, you fold space-time, and that's how wormholes work. I'm like, that's just thinking through like miracles, right? If you go to an Aboriginal indigenous type society and just do, I don't know, whatever, right? You heal someone of a wound, you give them a drug, they get better, or you have, I don't know, a gadget, you have a phone. They all think it's a miracle because they don't understand the technology. They don't understand the science, right? So it seems otherworldly. It seems miraculous. And so I feel like God's powers have a scientific basis. He's commanding the elements. He's doing things using higher laws and powers we just don't understand and don't currently have access to. But I don't think it's just magic or whatever, right? It's like there's probably order and law around all this stuff, including, right, how communication happens through prayer, for example, or inspiration, or how angels move around, and all that stuff. Fascinating. Sorry, I get kind of nerded out on some of the stuff thinking through. I get excited to one day, get my own Urim and Thummim, just be able to like Wikipedia everything. Like, how does this work and how does that work? And it's kind of fun to think about. So yeah, I think there'll be Mormons on Mars someday, with the big asterisk of if there's ever humans that get on Mars. But the same could apply to space stations or the moon, or pick your place. But to me, the far more interesting question is, man, what is it like for all these people on other planets, and how much have their civilizations kind of diverged from our own because of their own discoveries and their own experiences, and what is that like? I would love to see more science fiction about that type of thing. God's children on other planets, Jesus's visit. What does the religion look like on those planets? What do their scriptures look like? Fascinating stuff. So thanks for indulging me on a fun, nerdy topic, kind of outside the conventional, typical stuff I talk about, but it's been on my mind for a little bit, so I thought I'd share, and I'll see you next Sunday.